My name is Wendy, and when I was younger, I worked at a hospital that was officially decommissioned. I worked there all the way up until its closure 5 years ago in 2020. I don't want to give the name for legal reasons, but it was a small, rural hospital out in the forested mountains of Colorado, and was bordered on all sides by vast woodlands. I loved working there because of this, but was also really relieved to leave, especially after what happened. I worked at the hospital for something like 8 years and was a transplant from Northeast Missouri, which I've since moved back to. We'd never been especially busy, as hospitals go. There weren't a lot of people living near the place, which was largely why it was shut down, though that wasn't the only reason. The place was weird, and believe you me, I know weird. I'm a practicing pagan and a witch to boot. I know my way around some weird, but this place was different. When I first started working there, I absolutely loved it. It was right in the center of the vast woodland, filled with gorgeous fir trees, boulders, creeks, and plenty of stones and rocks. I collect them. In the spring after the thaw, it was like I worked in the Fey realm. Everything was so green and lush and just gorgeous. I loved seeing mountains every day, and I loved being and feeling so close to nature. I had gotten kind of headhunted by one of the doctors here because they needed a phlebotomist, which is what I do, and they needed one fast. I came pretty highly recommended, or so I was told by the head of the lab. When they offered to move me out there and help me get an apartment, I jumped at the chance, even though the money was only a little bit more than I'd been making. I spent the first week out there just exploring the area and orienting myself with the roads and byways. I like to find little shortcuts and secret ways around the places where I live. Back in Missouri, I knew every gravel road and can traverse 3 counties without touching asphalt, if I need to. Colorado was a different animal though, and most of the back roads were dirt, which meant mud for half of the year. I learned some of them though, and had fun trekking all over what was to become my new home. While I was on this early explorative expedition, I saw the first of many bizarre things that both unnerved and enticed me about the area. As I drove down an old highway through the woods, quite close to my new digs, I spotted something that made me stop my SUV right on the side of the road to get a better look. Just off the road, suspended between 2 trees, was the biggest spider web I'd ever seen in my life. It was something like 5 feet in diameter, and just at the top was a huge, fat-butted, yellow and black spider. It wasn't like a tarantula or anything, but it was big as hell and wild-looking. I stood there for a moment, marveling at the spider and her work, before cooing at her softly. Even though the spider herself didn't respond, the wind blew softly through the trees, and I knew that nature had heard me, which made me smile. I stopped by that spot a few more times, but I never saw the web or the spider again, which was a complete bummer. I looked too, because I just loved seeing crazy nature like that up close. Most of the time it was stuff like that, some kind of crazy-looking nature encounter, like an animal I'd never seen before, or a gnarly, twisted tree. But sometimes it was really weird, especially the closer I got to the hospital. Now, the hospital itself was pretty small, but with the forest outside, it felt like a labyrinth, and I noticed this especially when it rained a lot, which it often did here. Another oddity. The hospital was all one level, except for the basement, which had sub-levels that I didn't even know existed, until around the time the place closed down. There were only 2 entrances, and by the time we were shutting things down, we had closed down the main door and were only using the ER entrance. The hospital was decommissioned for a bunch of reasons, not the least of which was that there was just not enough people living in the area to justify keeping it open. So many people had moved away in 2020, despite the situation then, because so many businesses in the area went under, and there was no work. Then the board lost a lot of funding when the sublevels had an odd flood and had to be closed down. I used to see a lot of really bizarre shit out near the hospital, and only about half of it was like the spider web. Like while out on a smoke break, I straight up saw a fox, this beautiful bright red fox with a black tipped tail. It just stood up on its hind legs and tiptoed back into the woods when it noticed me looking at it. I remember laughing hysterically when it happened and feeling like I was going insane when I explained it to my coworker who had gone inside to use the restroom and not seen it. I also saw way less funny things that scared me pretty badly. Lots of shadows moving in the woods at night. Lots of movement at the edges of my vision that disappear when you look. And lots of really strange noises both out in the forest, which is to be expected, but also inside the hospital, which is less so. There was one instance where, and I know that I saw this because I'm still terrified now, but I was walking around outside after I got off, and I saw like a giant shadow person. This was in March, I think, so it was already getting pretty dark by the time I was getting off. It was something like 12 or 13 feet tall and standing next to a tree, with one hand holding a branch. Now you'd think I'd have screamed when I saw it, but I was just kind of like, whoa, and stopped abruptly staring at the thing. I remember feeling like I should have been scared, like really scared. But I was way more curious than anything. I'd seen shadow people before, but never one that huge before. It's usually an indication for me that I need to smudge my house, but I didn't think burning some sage was going to have much of an effect here. The figure, whatever it was, seemed to regard me curiously for a moment, stooping low in a gesture that seemed like it was cocking its head. Then, without so much as a moan, it turned and stalked off into the woods and disappeared. I stood out there, under the light of one of our exterior floodlights, staring into the gloom of the woods, but nothing ever came back out. After a while, I left, and I never took that particular route for a walk again. After that encounter, I started saging my office and lab just about once a week, and I did the same to my apartment, even though I seldom had anything happen there. I was definitely afraid, but I know how to protect myself. At least, I hope that I did. And I have to admit, while I was definitely wary of spirits, especially the dead, I was just far more fascinated by the experience. I didn't want something else to happen. I just expected it to, and I found myself getting excited about what I'd experience next. The really scary stuff didn't start until after the basement flooded though, and the hospital began to head into a downward spiral. Once our X-ray facility was ruined, it was just a matter of time before we had to close the doors. After the flood, activity on the main levels started ramping up, with mild activity being more intense and happening a lot more often than it had before. Where once we'd have a specific room where lights would flicker on a regular basis, now the entire wing had light issues. This might have been electrical, but it didn't feel that way, and when it was checked on, no electrical problems could be found. We also had issues with people reporting intruders in restricted areas, which almost never happened. They tell maintenance because we didn't actually have security, but when they'd check, or sometimes call the police, no one was ever found. More than that though, there was kind of an oppressive air around the hospital. People started feeling like they were being watched constantly, and I was one of them. It was like a dread, like that feeling you get when you're late for work because you overslept, but a constant dread. It was pretty awful, and it never really let up in those last few months, and while no one ever admitted it, it caused a lot of staff to quit and patients to seek care elsewhere, which likely contributed to the closure as well. But what was really weird, partially because only I seemed to notice, was that this heaviness seemed to abate almost the moment you stepped off the grounds of the hospital. The minute one foot stepped out in the woods around the facility, as I often did, especially during the day, the dread seemed to just drift away. The strangeness was still very palpable, but that oppressive feeling lifted once you weren't on the hospital grounds. I expected that why I was the only one to notice this is that most people conflate weird or woohoo with evil, dangerous, or just bad. I don't, and I never ever have. The spirit world, or what a lot of people call the paranormal, is just another aspect of reality, and just like the physical or material world, there's both good and evil, light and dark, benign and dangerous. The world of spirits is just as complicated and varied as the world we all live in every day, because it is the world we live in every day. Not everything dark is out to get you, or even interested in you. More importantly, not everything that shines like the sun is friendly. The sun burns brightly in the sky, and sometimes that's all it wants to do to you too. Anyway, while the last few months of working at the hospital weren't very fun at all, the last couple of weeks were even worse. The place was full-on deserted, and we had basically a skeleton crew for a staff. Of those still working who didn't have the letters at the end of their name, I had the most training. I wasn't a manager, but I was trained as a nurse. I just hadn't kept up with my certifications because I didn't need them for the job I was hired for. Our lack of personnel didn't seem to matter though, because we had a distinct lack of patients for them to treat. And in those last few weeks of being open, I could count on my two hands the number of people who even checked in, let alone stayed for more than one day. It was like working in a liminal space half the time. All of that, coupled with the fact that that awful feeling only increased as time wore on, made the last few days working there kind of unbearable. Between the activity, the isolation, and the dread, everybody was really on edge. It culminated in an experience that had the few of us who were left leaving, and aside from myself, never returning to the hospital. Like I said, I had no idea that the basement sublevels were even there, because I didn't have much to do with x-rays or radiology in general. I didn't even know we had a basement, honestly. I'm not super observant, unless there's danger. Then I tend to notice glaring things that others might miss. Regardless, what I came to learn was that while about a third of the basement was the radiology lab, most of the lower levels were taken up by research labs. Those were also apparently how the hospital got the majority of its funding. Once they shut down, money dried up, and it started a domino effect. The thing is, no one seemed to know what was being researched down there. And I asked. My work bestie Sam told me all about the labs and how they were restricted access. A lot of those phantom intruders were spotted down there apparently, but still, no one seemed to know what it was that had been researched down there. Not even my boss. just that the research had stopped. I was outside having a cigarette when Sam had explained that the flood in the sublevels below the basement had been caused by some kind of fire. The fire had gotten so out of hand that deliberately flooding the basement was the only option. And it got me wondering what was down there that would cause a fire. I mean, sure, it could have been an electrical thing, but that kind of fire was easily put out. Now, I don't know shit about fires or how they spread, so I might have just been full of shit there, but it seemed excessive to me. The more I muddled this over, the more curious I became, and I asked Sam if she'd ever been down to those lower levels before. She got kinda nervous and told me that she'd only gone down there once after dropping off something to radiology, and went down to see what it looked like. She said she had gotten a bad vibe the minute she hit the staircase and turned around immediately. Our conversation came to an abrupt halt when a black bear rounded a corner at the other end of the ER door, and Sam nearly jumped out of her skin and ran inside. Me, being the idiot who wants to pet all of the bears, got super excited and watched the animal for a minute. It was just wandering around, probably looking for our dumpsters and some food, or so I thought. After a minute of sniffing around, the bear seemed to notice me and raised its head to look in my direction. At first, I thought it was going to come at me, and I readied myself to bolt back inside, but it just held my gaze, and I got the distinct impression that it was trying to communicate. Now, I really wanted to just walk up and touch him, but I knew I'd likely die, or at least get mauled, neither of which interested me. As I was weighing the pros and cons of being mauled to death by a bear I'd just tried to pet, I heard the auto doors to the ER open behind me. I expected it to be Sam yelling at me to stop being an idiot, but the voice of Dr. Credu, my boss, came from the doors, calling my name. I turned to see him standing there, his face ashen, wearing a face of concern. I thought it was about the bear, but then he told me he needed my help inside right away. When I turned back to keep an eye on what the bear was doing, it was gone. Not moving away, not scampering or trying to hide, just gone. I looked around for the fuzzy dude for a while before Dr. Credu insisted I come inside again. The whole experience left me feeling very strange, but also in a state of heightened awareness. Someone or something was trying to tell me something, and I knew in my heart it was a warning of some sort. I went back inside with my boss and found pretty much the entire staff standing around in the main entrance of the ER. The only person missing was Tony, a nurse's assistant, who was apparently off looking for someone. Dr. Credu explained to everyone that our only patient, a guy named Tom, who was fighting a bout of cellulitis, was missing. There were only about a dozen of us there, but no one had seen him in the last half hour. Certainly not Sam or I, who were smoking and pining for bears. Dr. Credu insisted that we needed to do a thorough search of the hospital, inside and out, before we called the police, which was standard procedure. Everyone kinda took a wing or a department and just kinda went. I was chosen to search outside, since I was out there the most, and I didn't argue, even though I was still kinda worried about the bear. I kinda ran the perimeter of the building, mostly because we were all pretty sure Tom hadn't gone outside, and hadn't spotted him by the time I was halfway done. On my way back, I had to pass by that spot where I'd seen the shadow giant, and rather than feel scared or even nervous, I felt this intense need to get back inside the hospital, like something bad was going to happen if I didn't. I glanced into the woods as I passed the location, and shadows danced between the trees, furtively, hiding their secrets, but urging me to go. When I got back to the ER, it was deserted, as everyone was gone searching. I thought about waiting, but I'm one of those that, especially in a crisis, just feels that I have to do something productive. And so I thought about where the patient might likely have gone, or where the others might not be searching. The only place I could think of were the lower levels, and when I thought of them, the image of the bear looking at me came back into my head, completely unbidden. I full-on sprinted to the stairs that led down to radiology and practically leapt down them, taking 3 steps at a time. When I got down to the X-ray lab, I found it, as I suspected, deserted. I snooped around the area, half investigating this part of the hospital I'd never seen, and half looking and looking out for Tom. I heard a noise coming from a side door, and when I opened it, I found another set of stairs leading down. I was immediately overwhelmed by the same feeling that I know Sam had been talking about earlier. It was like the same dread that had permeated the hospital the last months, but way more intense. I knew that whatever was down there wasn't going to be bothered by any sage, and I reflexively reached into a little pocket at my waist where I keep a butterfly knife. I only didn't pull it out because I reminded myself that I was looking for a vulnerable patient and didn't want to take the chance of hurting him. As I descended the staircase, the oppressive feeling only intensified, and to such a degree that when I found the door at the bottom of it, it was really hard for me to actually open it. I did though, and what I found inside shocked me. On the other side of the door was a practically pristine, white, well-lit corridor that looked nicer than the ones in the hospital upstairs. The floor was covered in water though, which had become stagnant and gross. I looked up and then down the hallway, which was filled with heavy metal doors with no windows, and only numbers designating what they were for. I was about to say, screw it, and go back upstairs, when again, I heard an odd noise coming from down the hall, like a constant banging. I really didn't like it at all, and almost chickened out, but I kept reminding myself that the patient could be in danger and might need help. I forced myself to follow the noise, my tennis shoes sloshing slightly in the inch or so of whatever water was on the floor. The doors were all marked with numbers that started with 4, but I couldn't tell if that was an indication of the depth or just an area within the hospital. It wasn't long at all before I came to a door with the numbers 451 marked on a placard outside of it. I tried the door and it opened, pushing water around at my feet. I gasped when I looked inside the room, because it was a stark contrast to the hallway I was standing in. The walls were charred black and brown from fire damage, and it stunk of sulfur and melted plastic. Everything inside was torched beyond recognition, except for a metal table and file cabinet. Across the room, Tom stood naked except for his gown, hammering on another metal door with a fire extinguisher, which was the source of the banging. I yelled at him to get his attention, but he ignored me. Tom slammed the fire extinguisher into the door over and over again in a very mechanical way that led me to believe that he might not even realize what he was doing. I ran over to him and tried to pull the fire extinguisher away from him, but he just pressed on, hammering the door. At my wit's end, I pushed him aside to turn him around, reached back, and I slapped the living shit out of him. My strike seemed to knock Tom out of whatever trance he was in, and he dropped the fire extinguisher and looked at me like he had no idea what was going on. Then he winced and groaned as the pain from his swollen legs seemed to come back at him all at once. He asked me where he was, and I just told him that I'd get him back upstairs. He seemed so bewildered and confused, and I just felt so awful for him, because he was clearly in a lot of pain. But that's when I heard the voice. As I reached under Tom's arm to support him and I braced my hand on the door, which was almost too hot to the touch, something between a rasp and a whisper uttered on the other side of it, but it echoed inside my head. It said only one thing, but that phrase was enough to send a chill through my spine and make me want to do something more than get the living hell out of there.
Open the door.
The deep, distorted, malevolent whisper demanded as I pulled my patient towards the exit. It was like a command, and it was hard to resist, and even harder to ignore. But I did, and I got Tom, and I got the hell out of that room. The moment the door to room 451 closed, a scream like something straight from hell roared behind us and echoed through the oddly bright corridor. I was so terrified that I absolutely peed a little, but didn't have time to give a shit. I just pulled Tom towards the door to the staircase as fast as he would go. Tom was scared as hell too, and kept asking what the hell the screaming was. But I just ignored the question and kept urging him along through the fetid water, which must have been great for his condition. Sarcasm. When I got to the staircase door, I kicked it open. I pushed Tom through, and the screaming, which sounded somewhere between a wild animal and someone being tortured, was joined by intense hammering. It was like whatever was on the other side of that door was just beating against it. When we got inside the stairwell, I detected movement above me and looked up to see Dr. Cruddo, Sam, and a couple of others standing at the top of the steps, staring down at us. They could clearly hear the screaming and pounding as well, and were staring at me wide-eyed. I just shook my head and called for them to come down and to help me with Tom. Between the horrible sounds coming from the sublevels and Tom's cries of pain, we managed to get him upstairs as a group. We got him onto Tony's back, who just carried him up to the main floor from radiology. No one said a word about the screaming, but when I asked how any of them knew that I'd come downstairs, everyone said they thought they'd seen someone heading down there, and thought it was the patient. The doctor made the executive decision to transfer Tom to an urgent care clinic in a town about an hour away. We all worked together to clean him up, get him on some IV antibiotics, and get him into the ambulance, which Sam then drove to town with about half the staff. The rest of us shut down anything that might pose a danger or problem. We piled into our cars and followed the ambulance away from the hospital. The entire time we worked, the horrible howling screams that came from room 451 of the sublevel never stopped. They followed us all the way out onto the main road, and I was only sure that we were going to be all right when I spotted that same bear along the sides of the road. Its eyes followed my car, which was the last to leave, and I gazed back at the animal in longing and wonder, knowing that something in the forest had just saved all our lives, through me. As I said, I returned to the area of the hospital to make an offering of thanks to the bear, the shadows, and the woods in general. I had no idea what force or entity had helped us that day, but it had, and I wanted to acknowledge that. But I did not set one foot on the hospital grounds again, and I won't as long as I live. I knew that if I were pulled back to that door, I'd not have the strength to resist the command again. I realized as I was laying my offering that it had to be me to go down to that sublevel and stop Tom. Yes, saving his life was important, and I'm grateful that I did it. But it was so much more important that the door never be opened. If anyone else had been in that room in that moment, they would have opened it. And well, I don't even want to think about what would have happened. What's important is that it wasn't opened. I moved back to Missouri almost immediately, and I got a job at the hospital that I worked at before. It was like I'd never left, and that the time in Colorado was more like an extended trip rather than a life-changing move. I live in a pretty calm and mostly happy life now, but I think about the door inside room 451 a lot. The image of it is blurred into my mind, and when I think about it, I'm not filled with wonder or curiosity like with the bear, or the forest shadows, or any of the other weird crap that I've seen in my life. I'm terrified because if I listen carefully, I could still hear the screaming.